The title of the keynote is "The Page is Dead, Long Live the Page." I have a bad habit of trying to make really like bombastic titles for my presentations so that people will come to them. It's gone bad a couple of times, but I hope this should actually like live up to the title. The idea is basically how to approach building Drupal sites in a way that, in a way that allows us to continue using and leverage the work that we've done years into the future, rather than having to scrap and rebuild and scrap and rebuild every time a new set of tools ships or a new design comes down the pipeline or something like that. You can feel free to heckle on Twitter using the Drupal Campbox Valley hashtag, or dead pages, or meerkats. As Will said, my name is Eaton. I've been working inside of the Drupal world for probably about 8 years now, which there are people who've been around longer, but some of them are more bitter than me. I work with Lullabot. We do strategy, design, and development, usually for relatively large projects. But a lot of the early years of Lullabot started out doing training and tutorials and public workshops for everyone from, an in-house developer at a large company to an independent person who just wanted to build a new website or needed to start freelancing and needed to come up to speed on Drupal. So a lot of the lessons that we learn in working on large sites, they're still really deeply baked into sort of the DNA of how we look at things and how I look at things, that we end up continually looking back and trying to figure out, okay, so how do these lessons ripple out to a larger community and a larger pool of people building Drupal sites than just like, Sony or, a magazine that wants to convert to Drupal or something like that. There are interesting things going on in those big, high-profile sites, but hopefully there are really useful lessons that we can still learn that apply across the board. So my big bombastic statement to sort of kick this whole thing off, and this is where you can feel free to start arguing or disagreeing with me, is that pages, the concept of a page on the web, is no longer inherently content. Instead, it's a place where content happens to live. We're going to talk about what that means and what the implications of it are, like over the course of this session, but that's really the core message that I'm trying to convey. Again, this is based purely on vigorous opinion and lots of arm waving. It's an ongoing conversation in the web world, but I hope it's convincing. So, 2 Drupal developers walk into a bar. This is actually a true story. It's not much of a stretch at all if you've ever been to DrupalCon. But this specific story is actually from several years ago. A friend of mine, Blake Hall from Wisconsin, he's helped organize the Wisconsin Drupal camps for a couple of years. He joined Lullabot several years back, and we were just finishing up like one of those really grim projects that feels like it's never going to end, and it finally concludes with doing the 2 days of training with the client where you actually teach them how to actually use the node edit form, and there's lots of people banging their heads, but eventually it all comes together and you're exhausted. And so we went, traipsed off to the hotel, just went down, got a drink, and just started chatting with the bartender. And the bartender asked what we did, and oh yeah, you guys make websites and stuff like that. And he asked Blake, so yeah, what kind of websites do you do? And it had been a really long week, and Blake's just like, well, we did the Grammys. And the bartender's eyes just get really big. Whoa! So that sounds like a lot of pages. And it's funny because just that way of putting it captured a really 1998 to 2002 sort of way of describing what the kind of work that we do actually is. I mean, and I don't mean to go, ha ha, he said pages, because really that's a very natural way of thinking about it from the perspective of someone who's browsing a website. here's a URL, we call it a page, I go somewhere else, it's a different page. It all makes sense. But anybody who's built a Drupal site before, or really any kind of really dynamic website, understands that it's a lot fuzzier and it's a lot more complicated than that. Because in terms of making a page the way a designer in 1999 used to make a page, you might only make maybe 10 or 15 of those in the course of a website, making HTML templates and tweaking the CSS and stuff like that. But in terms of how many different pages of content there could be thousands, dozens, hundreds of thousands of pieces of content on a really large site. And that weird fuzzy line between a page as this natural normative, metaphor for what you look at and what you're surfing around on really tends to collide when we start thinking about the planning process and how we're going to approach the website. If a site has 6,000 pages, but they all follow exactly the same template, and they all look exactly alike, how do you estimate that? What about a site that has 1,000 pages, but every single one is a crazy, cobbled together in Microsoft Word in a WYSIWYG editor monstrosity? There's a radical difference between what goes into those two different projects and how to even think about the work that goes into them. And that's really where the heart of this is, where the heart of this talk is. How do we start looking at things in a way that helps us as we plan out these projects and helps us as we move towards a more complicated web and a more complicated internet? The interesting thing is this whole weird tension is very, very old. It actually goes back to the very first email that proposed the World Wide Web. This is from Tim Berners-Lee in 1990. He said, hypertext is a way to access information as a web of nodes in which the user can browse at will. When starting a hypertext browser, you'll be presented with a hypertext page, which is personal to you. And even, also, he said, phase 1 of the web should take 3 months. It's good to know things haven't changed. But what I find really interesting is that even in that initial document talking about the idea of the web, there's this tension between what is the basic fundamental unit of stuff that we're making and tracking and tying together, and what is the thing that someone perceives when they visit it. He's talking about the page as what someone sees in a browser, but these nodes of interlinked stuff that actually get managed by the people producing the web. And I think that's something that we've seen carried through. In the early days, there was a very, very strong correlation between one of those nodes of content and the page that someone saw. But that's becoming less and less useful. The page is a metaphor for what people are looking at, not the thing itself. Did anybody use the program HyperCard way back in the day? Yeah, HyperCard, represent. I literally am contractually bound to mention HyperCard in every presentation that I give. It's basically a piece of software that shipped with every Mac back in the early 80s, mid-80s. And it let people build these rich applications with different pieces of content linked to each other and custom code woven in. It's a really, really cool thing. But what's interesting is that it was very, very bound, especially in its early life, to this metaphor of the card. Every screen that you built in HyperCard was this thing called a card, and moving from screen to screen was flipping cards. It was a really cool metaphor that helped people ramp up very quickly because they could think of this complex database application they were making as like a deck of index cards that were cross-referenced and you could skip between. But the problem is that as people started making more and more complex HyperCard applications, the card metaphor just really didn't work. And anybody who tried using it or tried using it to present an interface to people, they ran into all kinds of problems because it didn't actually match what they were building. It just happened to be the sort of natural vocabulary of the program. Also, even in Drupal, we've had a pretty significant problem with this whole page nomenclature. Does anybody remember when we had a content type called page? Does anybody realize that we don't have a content type called page anymore? Has anybody faced, say, trying to explain to someone who's been handed a Drupal site why making a page doesn't actually let you control the page. Just the page, not the page, because that's a template. But the page is this. We've got a kind of content that we didn't even have a good noun for other than it just goes in a place and you write it. And we ended up having I think something like a 3-year-long heated argument about that in the Drupal.org issue queues. And the answer was ultimately, we'll rename it from page to basic page. So kudos for realizing something was wrong. But again, this whole what noun do we use problem is a significant one.
Still is.
Kill it? Just kill it? Yeah.
No, it still is.
Oh, it still is? It's still called just page?
No, it still is a what noun, how we name things.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Naming things is one of the 3 hard problems of computing. Optimal cache invalidation and naming things. And then off by 1 error is implied by the 3 problems. But wait for it. Okay. So I think a lot of the reason that people are facing this more and more today, because we see this kind of tension coming up, I think a lot more than it used to, maybe 5 years ago, or even, if you want to feel really old, 10 years ago in the web, because we're not just building websites anymore. We're not just building HTML pages that we throw onto a server and people look at. The rise of mobile, I think, caused a lot of people to panic because not only were they thinking about building parallel mobile websites, but suddenly this idea of mobile apps came into play. And unfortunately, although mobile apps are really cool, your content still has to get into that app somehow. And if all you're doing is just taking a pile of HTML that you've designed for a desktop website, you're trying to squeeze that into a mobile design or siphon those into an app, well, you're going to have problems. And it gets even more complicated when you start to think of the ways that our content, the ways that our web pages have to go out to the rest of the world today. It gets really, really tangly. A lot of the stuff that our clients and our colleagues are working with, they have to have right content that can not only live on the web page, it can go out on social media channels and actually make sense. Stuff that has to be repurposed in emails that get sent out every morning or every week or every 2 hours, depending on what kind of company you work for. Sometimes content needs to be exposed via APIs so that other companies can get in there and search it, or that other people can write other web clients against it. Even things like creating print-friendly versions of stuff that was originally designed for the web. This is really common for small businesses that have things like product lists, product info sheets and stuff like that. Those are non-trivial problems. And designing and building like parallel versions of everything is pretty unsustainable. But I mean, that's ultimately where Drupal comes in, or any kind of CMS, right? The idea that you can make content, and the system is responsible for making all of those different parallel versions, all of those different permutations of a given page of content. Does anybody know the Ballad of John Henry? A couple of people. Okay, yeah, it's part of Disney's American Legends, so it will be preserved in our nation's history until the sun burns out. But basically, it's a story of a guy who worked on the railroad, and he basically was a steel driver. He drove steel stakes into the ground, and hard labor. Had a giant hammer, and he was the best guy on the railroad team. And then the railroad company sent a steam engine. They could pound stakes faster. And the story is basically him competing against this machine, this steam engine. And he took two giant hammers, and he hammered and he hammered and he hammered, and he beat the steam engine, and he died of a heart attack. And so it's kind of a sad story, but it's this man and machine battle. And I always thought, after listening to it, man, that really sounds like the process of being a webmaster in the 90s. Oh my gosh, it's 2006, we need to update the footer.
Yes.
Pull out the hammers, or a regular expression, depending on how hardcore you were. And The rise of tools like Drupal, even WordPress, or heck, PHP New was a giant step up for the people who sort of got into the web world in the day when you literally were hand managing thousands of pages. The problem is that transition period, that arrival of automated dynamic web building tools, we started treating them just sort of by default as a steam engine, a way to make pages faster, a way to cut down the amount of time we needed to make a bunch of pages. And that brings us back to this whole metaphor question. Are we really making pages? Is that what our goal is, to make 80 bajillion pages? Or is there something else we're missing? Karen McGrane, who's one of the authors that I absolutely love, who writes and speaks a lot about content management, content strategy, and how new technology shifts are changing things. In the Harvard Business Review, she had an article a couple of months ago that said the way that we publish on the web is mostly derived from what we know about putting ink on paper. And that makes sense, because that's something that we've been doing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas publishing on the web is something we've been doing for roughly as long as Nirvana. But the problem is as this shifts, and as the number of devices that our content has to be displayed on grows, as the number of different channels we're publishing on grows, the future ends up being in smaller and smaller chunks of discrete bits of content that we can sort of reshuffle and reassemble into new containers as needed. This isn't actually an unfamiliar concept inside of Drupal. The idea of having a full version of a piece of content and a teaser version of a piece of content. And you can even build alternate views, like how should this piece of content look when it's in the rotator at the top of the page. We can build those sorts of views of each discrete piece of content, assuming that it will live in many different places throughout our website. That's something that's sort of deep in Drupal's DNA, but I don't think has really rippled into the terminology that we use when we plan and build stuff. That'll be important later. File that away. There will be a callback. So that shift from we're building pages and we're slapping them up on the web to we've got all these bits of content and we assemble them as needed is something that a lot of people are referring to as decoupling. We're basically decoupling the underlying content that we work with and the pages that it lives on. There's a guy named User Advocate on Twitter. He's active in the Drupal community, and at Drupal Camp Toronto a couple of years ago, he said something that has always really, really struck me. And he said that what we used to call the page has become a unit of business intent. Now, yeah, there's already laughter. Before you start throwing things at me and shout, "Enterprise, unclean!" Even for a small business website, or even for a personal homepage, or anything that we're building, what he meant by that was basically that at any given URL on the website, the question that should be active is, what is the purpose of the person who's accessing this? What are they trying to get? What do they care about? Why are they actually visiting this page or this URL? And then on the flip side, as the person or the company that builds and produces and publishes this stuff, what's my purpose in putting it out there? Is it to tell people about my product? Is it to get them to trust me, and believe that I am a reputable and worthy vendor to work with? Or to say, hey, here's my portfolio, there's lots of stuff. We don't just build these things and shove them out there because everybody else is doing it. We do it because there's something that we want to accomplish, and then people who come to our sites have the same kinds of desires and needs. And thinking about our sites in those terms of, okay, so what is this core need that exists? I want to communicate something. Other people who are visiting want to find something out. Starting to describe our pages in terms of those intentions rather than a wad of body copy and maybe an image that happens to live at that URL is a really big shift. Internally at Lullaby, we've started to talk about that in terms of treating the sitemap, that sort of traditional tree view of the whole site and what it lives, and where all the little navigation trees are, starting to treat that as a list of goals, a list of intentions, rather than a list of pages. Every one of those little boxes on the sitemap could actually be a bunch of pages, could be one piece of content that lives there to communicate a particular message, or it could be a whole cluster of them, like the blog section on the site. Why is it there? Okay, this is total digression, but show of hands. How many people have worked on sites that have a blog? Okay, how many people know why the hell there was a blog on the website? Okay, you win. And I think it's sort of a running joke, especially when we're working with large organizations. We're like, we need to engage, we need to be responsive. Let's put a blog on the website. The CEO can blog. That will change everything. Well, maybe. But all you've really done is decided on a new page that should be there. The question is what's going on there? Why? Why would anyone care what the CEO is saying at this particular moment in time? Why would the company care? I mean, theoretically, the worst case scenario is their CEO says something horribly embarrassing, and because you haven't set up any kind of workflow system, they just hit publish and then it's a controversy. So, it could be bad. It's never happened, ever. But this question of shifting towards a list of goals rather than simply a list of pages, that's significant. And content, the actual stuff that writers produce, or an overworked administrative assistant enters in because someone drove by their desk and slapped a thing and said, "Hey, write a news post about this. Congratulations." Those aren't pages. Those are resources and assets that we use on pages to achieve the goals those pages are built around. I hope I'm not getting too weirdly philosophical about something as simple as a page, but that's kind of my thing. We tend, at Lullabot, we've moved towards a system that we use to sort of describe the kinds of content that are there in any Drupal site. This is before we start talking about pages at all. We talk about asset content types. Now, that's not necessarily media assets, like video or whatever, but it's basically kinds of content that people care enough about that they would actually come to your site for. On a news site, that might be a news piece or an article or a video clip or something like that. On a company that sells products, that might be a product information sheet. It's those core assets that, regardless of what your site looks like or what gets trendy, a year from now, these are things that you're going to want to keep. And there's long-term value sort of invested in them when they get created. There's also structural content types. Those are basically the things that we use to organize stuff. In Drupal, we've had taxonomy for a long time. Any old-timers can probably think back to the days when every Drupal site involved throwing a bunch of taxonomy terms at things to organize and build your navigation section. But the idea is that there are kinds of content whose real purpose is to form a container for other kinds of content that live under them. Then we've also got presentational content, like the weird ephemeral stuff that every website really needs, but you're probably not going to want to reuse it, and it may go away in 2 weeks or whatever. Things like that bit of stuff that goes in the sidebar block this week because there's something happening, or the rotator at the top of the home page that just links to another article and somebody wants to highlight it. Those are useful pieces of content, but they're kind of short-lived. Now, none of these things are necessarily pages in and of themselves. We also end up building what we call displays. And this is early on in the design process, where we're saying, okay, so what do you need? What does the site structure look like? What does the hierarchy look like? Basically, a display is those different kinds of chunks of intent that form the structure of the website. Like the About Us section isn't necessarily a page, it's a section dedicated to personalizing the company and making it feel more approachable, or communicating that we have a strong team that is, worthwhile, that has lots of skills and you should work with us. Those chunks we call displays. So on the average site, we may be looking at maybe a dozen different displays. And some of those may correspond 100% to a particular type of Drupal content. Like a news story on a news site is going to have a dedicated display for showing a news story. But there are going to be other sections of the site, everything from the home page to sort of topical landing pages and stuff like that, that are really going to be assembled out of all of those different kinds of pieces. And we need to think not just about the individual pieces of content, not just about the overall page for that particular spot on the site, but how they all play together and how the display can be assembled out of the underlying stuff. Now, one of the really important parts of that is something called content modeling. It's near and dear to my heart. I nerd out about it all the time. And it's a very natural fit for Drupal. We've had think tools like CCK, content types, custom fields, relationships between content types. A lot of the initial work that goes into many Drupal sites starts out with this question of what types of content should I have? What are their properties? How do they connect to each other? Stuff like that. That's content modeling. It's awesome. But it's also very easy for us in the Drupal world when we start from that page-oriented, design-oriented perspective to start modeling not the essence of what a news story is, or the essence of what a press release is for us, or what a biography of a member of our team is. Instead, we start from that design, and we start sort of chopping holes in a mock-up and saying, okay, what are the pieces that are going to have to change? Well, that field is going to have to change depending on what the news story is. And our content types become a reflection of sort of the holes that are punched out of the design, rather than the essence of what that type of content means, regardless of how it's presented. Figuring out how to model the actual meaning of a given content type versus how it happens to be presented in the current design is one of the big sort of shifts that I think all of us are slowly but steadily moving towards. This is the part where I quote Bruce Lee, because it's fun. He says, don't get set into one form. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Be water, my friend. That's the ideal that we're trying to move towards with this idea of restructurable, reworkable content. We build small, meaningful chunks that we can assemble into any of those sort of intentional displays that we need. So, what does this look like? I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly because I have a tendency to get wordy and get excited and wave my arms a lot when we talk about like concrete examples on live sites. But what I want to do is go through a couple of different websites that have launched recently and say, how does this different way of looking at things, this chunks of content that we assemble into pages, how does that play out in their like actual real world projects? The first one is a pure marketing website. It's a company that wants to tell the world about its products and convince them to give it money and make sales. Cool, very, very classic work. Now, the problem that they ended up facing was that this company had a bunch of different products, a bunch of different services, and what they found was that every time they went to update the website, every time a new permutation of a particular service launched, they were reinventing the wheel. It's a classic, like, you need Drupal, you need a CMS kind of problem. They wanted to be able to leverage the work that they did in talking about, say, how awesome their customer service is on all of the different places on the site where they felt customer service was important. But how do they do that without just repeating themselves or copying and pasting text? Because they weren't talking about making one master customer service page that got linked to. They really wanted it to be part of the page that someone was looking at. Excuse me. So this is what it ended up looking for them. These are just some real quick diagrams of like what the Drupal content types looked like for them. They created content types for solutions, like a service that we offer or a problem that we solve or something like that. They created a content type for product. They created a content type for just a dumb page. This is a page where we are going to stick some stuff. Every website ultimately ends up accumulating at least several of those just dumb pages where we have to stick stuff. Yeah, what are you going to do? But then they also had a content type they called fragment. It was basically a reusable chunk that never lived on its own page, but was always used as a part of another page. So things like the 5 different little canned explanations of their awesome customer service and how much their customer support people care and stuff like that. They had a couple of those that they could pull from and weave into those pages whenever they wanted to. And in fact, most of the solution and product pages had very, very little content that was actually unique to those pages. Most of them were like, here's a pricing sheet and a number to call to sign up, and the rest of the page for, say, hosting, web hosting, was actually assembled out of those fragments that they could reuse and repurpose. And that allowed them to make sure that their marketing people, when they needed to throw together a page for a new service, didn't have to reinvent the wheel, didn't have to come up with new, fresh ways of saying the same things over and over and over. And when something changed, like say, oh, well now we're doing 24/7 technical support instead of just 8, instead of 9 to 5, they could change that in maybe 3 or 4 places, and it rippled through so that they were saying the same message all over the place. And also, it allowed them to do things like translation and localization a lot more efficiently, which sometimes you care, sometimes you don't. It's always nice to have that in your back pocket when someone announces, oh yes, also we're in Canada, so it's got to be in French too. So that was actually Rackspace.com. They had, their entire site was built out of pages like this. And in this example, things like file and data backup, we're secure and reliable, are you looking for a particular use case? All of these things were just those fragment content types. And a given page was really just a collection of them. It was a container of those fragments. And it worked really well for them. The important and interesting thing to remember is that in terms of the number of pieces of content in their site, very, very few corresponded to an actual classic page in web terms. Those fragments and the individual pieces that were reused all over the place never had a URL that they lived at. They were those assets that kept getting reused on all of their different pages. And it required a different kind of way of thinking about it. And it also required carefully thinking what the experience was going to be for the people who had to edit and update that stuff. It wasn't a showstopper, but it meant they could no longer count on, well, go to the page and hit the edit button. They had to give them better ways to think about those assets.
Do you have a name for nodes or entities that have no life as a page? I call it meta-content.
I call them things. The question was, is there any word for nodes and entities that don't have an actual page? It depends. I mean, we tend to call them assets, just because that sort of decouples the whole, the terminology from the idea that it will ultimately live on a page, but it depends. We tend to get into long, vigorous discussions of terminology with the clients that we work with, because sometimes they already have similar concepts that they want to use, or similar terminology they want to use, and sometimes it's easier just to adopt the terminology that someone understands and is used to. So the next one is a corporate intranet. Doesn't this sound thrilling? Aren't you glad you woke up early and came out here and sat at a table to hear someone talking about corporate intranets? Yay! This one actually, I think is kind of interesting and kind of fun. The specific intranet was basically the internal HR section for a really large company, offices in 20 countries and stuff like that, and 50,000 pages between all the languages, between explaining their policies for part-time people, full-time people, contract people, the whole deal. They wanted to pull that down to 50 pages and do it with Drupal. Well, yeah, that was interesting, and that was fun. The good news is it actually turned out to be possible, and they'd done a lot of work beforehand, so they had a really good, deep understanding of all the kinds of content they were talking about, all the weird variations that it had. And their content model ended up looking a little like this. The topic pages and the subtopic pages, like planning for your future, and they had things like retirement plans and long-term health insurance and disability issues, and what if you're moving to another country and you need information on how to change offices and stuff like that. They treated those as topics, And then there were subtopics. And in terms of the pages that people navigated, that was it. They just wanted to have a very, very simple thing where you could scan the front page and see what the big main topic headings were, see a subtopic that you needed information on, click it, and just read what was appropriate to you. Now, the way they accomplished this was that underneath each one of those subtopics was actually a huge pile of Drupal nodes. Each one had audience targeting information attached to it. Things like what role is this person in, what profile fields are appropriate to them, and stuff like that. It required some custom code in Drupal. But the basic idea was you had all of these different documents that were the various permutations of how do you sign up for insurance for all of the different countries and all of the different types of employees. Somebody would hit one of those subtopic pages, and the subtopic didn't actually contain any of that information. It just had a bunch of links to all of those different versions of how do you sign up for insurance. And it was responsible for pulling in the one that was most appropriate for whoever was logged in. It was a little squirrely, and naturally, there ended up being a news content type, because every website, in addition to needing a frequently asked questions section and a news section and a page full of stuff content type, those are standard. But the vast majority of their content lived in those different documents that they had. And the end result was that they were able to actually accomplish 50 pages as far as the user of the website was concerned. Under the hood, they still had dozens of thousands of different pieces of content that they were managing. But from the experience of the user, they just walked in, they could click on the topic they needed, they could look at what they wanted information about, and get something that was tailored to that. Didn't make managing all of that stuff any simpler, because they still had 8 bajillion variations. But this way of separating all of those individual pieces of content from the pages that they lived on allowed them to dramatically simplify the experience of really going in and finding out that complicated stuff. And this is like sort of what it ended up looking like from their perspective. People could go in, they could look at this kind of structure, click through, and say, oh, okay, I know what I'm looking for, and they would magically just get the document they needed. I say magically because it took like 4 months to actually make that work right without giving people the wrong document. But by golly, once it was done, we could call it magic. And in fact, they even ended up using some of the same stuff to target individual sentences inside of the nodes to particular audiences, which was another adventure for another presentation entirely. But that content model of just treating the topics and the subtopics as pages and everything else as this soup of stuff that could get pulled in as needed was another one of those things that we started looking at and recognizing as a significant shift from the old, you make a node, it makes a page. And that's your website kind of approach. Another one, and this is a little more extreme, was a video streaming service that some friends of ours ended up working heavily on. They wanted to manage and promote piles and piles of video. They wanted to put it online, and it was also rights managed. Like, if you are a Comcast subscriber, you have to do X and Y and Z to actually view the video. If you're a Time Warner subscriber, you would have to jump through this completely different set of hoops. So there was this whole weird problem that they had, but they wanted to manage the stuff behind the scenes in Drupal. Even though they didn't host the videos, there were different rights depending on what zip code you lived in. It was a mess. This is what their content model looked like. There were literally no pages on the website that corresponded to Drupal nodes. All they had was this client-side JavaScript app that got written that did their crazy, like, oh, you hover over this, like a sports team flies out and everything. They did all that stuff on the client side, and they used JSON feeds coming from a Drupal website to say, when we need to put a new video online, somebody on the back end goes in, creates a node, enters in all the information that we need to describe it to users on the front end, hook it up with the back end and stuff like that. And then there's a bunch of custom code that ties in with all of our cable video providers and stuff like that. But it worked. And there's laughter over there. It was just as shocking to our team as anyone else that it worked. But the end result was, a perfectly functional, cool-looking video website that didn't really look like a traditional Drupal website because It wasn't a Drupal website as far as anybody browsing it was concerned, but still, it was a Drupal project. We just utterly and completely torn the concept of a piece of content apart from a page. And it proved pretty useful. And especially because I've always wanted to put a giant imposing circle in a content model diagram, just because. It looks like the Death Star. And the final one is a cookbook. Basically, a guy that I know had a friend in Seattle who was a hardcore like foodie chef. And he'd been running his own restaurant. He had this like idiosyncratic like philosophy of how there were really only truly 3 seasons, and the different flavors correspond to seasons. And he was, really well-known chef in the area. And he had this fascinating like philosophy of cooking and flavor that he wanted to communicate. And he was like, I should make a cookbook. And his friend was like, what you should do, you should totally make something more than a cookbook. You should do like the all-singing, all-dancing, awesome digital e-cookbook web thing. Won't this be awesome? He said, yeah, let's do this. And then they started doing it. It was monstrously complicated. Because that's what happens when you make the all-singing, all-dancing e-digital thing. But they actually ended up building it as a Drupal website. And this is, ironically, the cookbook has the most complicated content model that we've talked about so far. But they had things like season as a particular core kind of content. They had varietals as a content type. I think it was the first time I'd ever seen a website that had varietal as a content type. It's also where I learned the word charcuterie, which is like sausagey, cheesy type stuff. It's delicious, but I only learned it was a word through this project. But they organized in plates, and then underneath plates there were recipes, and then they had steps, they had ingredients and techniques, and basically all of these interesting little pieces that, from a chef's perspective, these mattered. These were individual things, like a particular technique, like dicing or braising something or whatever. You could reuse that in all kinds of different recipes. So it's not just part of the big wad of text that is a recipe. It's an important technique that you use in a particular step of a particular recipe that's used for the main dish of a full plate that is the particular, meal that you are telling people about. So this weird, like, tangly little model that they built captured this chef's vision for like what he wanted to communicate about cooking. And then they also had just a pile of media assets, like videos, photos, and the whole thing that they could use. Now that seems like a whole lot of work for basically making recipe pages. But the interesting result, this is the Lark Cookbook. If you like foodie cooking and like beautiful things, I highly recommend checking it out because it's awesome. And I say that with no bias because I didn't build it. But this was the result. They've got a website up at larkcookbook.com, and you're browsing through the featured recipes here, and it shows this gorgeous photography. But in addition, they also generate an iPad app from the Drupal website. They use it as the data source for a custom-developed iPad app that shows a different set of media, because it's a lot easier to weave in a bunch of those high-resolution videos and stuff like that. The browsing interface is completely different, and it's really geared towards the idea that somebody may be like propping this up in a kitchen and using it, as opposed to reading through it when they're trying to figure out what meal they want to cook or something like that. They also generated a print cookbook from the Drupal website, which I think is pretty sweet. And they admitted that, yes, there was some copying and pasting involved with InDesign in a couple of places, but they also decided they could have automated that if they wanted to. It was just because they were producing a single cookbook rather than a bunch of different cookbooks. It was easier to just, hand copy and paste some of the data. But the end result was that they ended up building a Drupal website that literally none of the individual pieces of content that were being created corresponded to actual pages that people looked at when they visited the website. Because that website version that we looked at is a different Drupal site. It pulled content from the real Lark Cookbook site they were modeling. They were just using this as a big pool full of stuff that they could repurpose in all kinds of different ways. And the shocking thing is how well it worked once they really internalized the difference between them. They weren't making pages, they were making recipes and plates, and they were capturing meaning about what this particular chef's view of cooking was. And that allowed them to repurpose it in all kinds of ways, come up with new designs, new ways of putting the content out in different channels and different devices than they ever would have expected. It goes way beyond what even like a responsive web design or something like that is even capable of. And if they hadn't taken the time to think about the real deep meaning of what they were building rather than just the appearance of it, none of that would have been possible. So of course, all of these different kinds of websites, the marketing site, the corporate intranet, the video streaming service, the cookbook. It's still weird referring to a cookbook as a website, but I think that's what makes me love that example so much. Across all of these different examples, the common thread there is the growing separation between the page that we present stuff on and the underlying chunks of content that we track and we manage and we model so that the people who are editing it and the people who are creating it know how to enter stuff in or where to find what they need to manage the website. That disconnect is significant. And going back to this model, you can also look through a lot of those examples and start thinking about, what are the underlying assets, those enduring pieces of stuff that we're always going to have around, regardless of the design. What are the structures, like variety or season, in the cookbook example, that allow us to organize and group stuff? And then what are just the presentational bits that, they may live for a little while on the website, but they're not something that we need to sweat bullets on reuse or long-term, longevity for those content types. And then there's that display, the idea of what is a screen on the iPad app? What is a given page on the website? What is a given chapter in the book? Those kinds of ways of pulling those things together and organizing them. Those displays are actually one of the places where it's actually easier to start communicating with clients and throwing wireframes and throwing mock-ups. But those are also informed by all the underlying content elements that we're using to build them out. So I'll stop rambling. Cut to the chase. What are the lessons, like the real actual lessons for building websites and thinking about websites that we can take away from a bunch of this vigorous arm waving I've been doing? The first one is to remember that pages, like a web page, is just a useful metaphor for helping people understand what they're doing when they're clicking around and reading stuff. We don't have to be bound to the implications of the page metaphor. And even more importantly, when we start thinking about how to help people when they're editing and managing their content, simply building bigger and better and faster and prettier tools for managing pages is not necessarily going to help us with the kind of forward-thinking problems that we're encountering when content has to live in a bunch of different places. If all the work that we put into improving the experience of using the websites focuses on, here's a page that gets presented to a visitor, how do you edit it? That can help with certain kinds of things, but it misses the mark with this idea of the soup of content that populates these intentional displays. The other one is that content assets, the reusable stuff that's really core to a site and its purpose and what it's going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now, even if the design changes. Those assets and their meaning and the goals that you're trying to accomplish with the website have to come first, way before wireframes or Photoshop files or what features will be cool to have on it. Those kinds of decisions can inform those things, and they drive a lot of those visual decisions, but they can't be the first part of it. You have to start with the content, its meaning, and what the goals you're trying to accomplish are. The other one is that it's useful to start thinking about an additional layer on top of the individual pieces of content, like a layer of displays or presentations or pages, if you will, that use and sort of remix and assemble those underlying content assets in order to accomplish the goals. And if you're working with a client, I'm not sure why I just naturally assume that, people here are working with clients and building stuff most of the time. That's not necessarily the case for everyone. Sometimes you are your own client, in which case I'm so sorry. I am my own worst client, and I'm guessing that applies to a lot of people. But in those cases, you don't necessarily have to communicate all of the complexity, but understand that when people are looking at visual presentation, that's the display that lives on top of the content, not the content itself. And finally, this content-first approach of figuring out what the bits are, figuring out what they mean, figuring out why you're using them and why you're showing them to people, it's a future-friendly approach. It allows you to respond a lot more quickly and a lot more nimbly to new needs that arise in the future. Whether it's, oh my gosh, we need a new page on topic X, or oh man, the design just looks really outdated because somebody thought lots of drop shadows were cool. Now it needs to be flat. Those kinds of changes are a lot easier to do on top of a sort of decoupled base of content assets than it is if you built all of those pieces of content with the assumption that they're going into a particular design. It makes a huge difference. And with that, I will abruptly stop rambling and ranting and open up for questions. I think we've got probably about 5 minutes left, maybe 10. So, oh wow, right on the ball. Yes?
Did you use panels for any of those movies?
The question was, did I use panels for any of those? I think 2 of them, yes. I know Rackspace and the corporate intranet both use panels. Some more than others. I think I work with developers who both love and hate panels. Sometimes it's the same person who both loves and hates panels. One of the things that I think is really fascinating about panels is that it allows you to go in and say, here is a page that lives at a particular URL. It is a dumb container as far as Drupal is concerned. And then my job is to figure out what stuff flows into it. And that way of looking at the challenge of architecting and planning a site that panels just brings to the table is a really good match for this way of talking about things. And I love panels for that reason. The downside is that, like any popular and feature-rich Drupal module, there's a lot of pros and cons on the nitty-gritty technical details of how it does certain things that are way outside the scope of this conversation. But yeah, that idea of you build your pages and you build your structure and then stuff flows into it, that's a very natural fit for panels. Yes?
Do you find the level of abstraction of the content to be intimidating to people when you're trying to train them? That seems like the biggest thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Basically, is this level of abstraction something that's intimidating when you're trying to train people who will actually be using the website? This level of abstraction isn't necessarily the way we talk to end users of the website. This is how we think about the planning process and going into how are we going to construct this. What we have found is that telling people things like, oh, okay, when you need to go update the website, there are 5 kinds of things you can make. There's a press release, there's a customer, or there's a, my mind just blanked, but a case study or something like that, or a product. These are the 4 things that you're going to need to create. Here's what you fill out. And in a perfect world, your job is not to worry about how it looks or where it appears or anything like that. The design and the site itself takes care of that. That tends to be a good thing from their perspective. The downside, of course, is when there are still stakeholders that are their bosses who say things like, okay, you need to go put this thing on this page because I want this picture to be there. And then, you still got to negotiate those kinds of things, but it's not necessarily that everyone needs a bunch of layers of abstraction. In some ways, it's figuring out ways to communicate to the people who are actually entering the content. Here are 5 meaningful things that you can make. The site takes care of what to do with them. You don't have to think about being a web designer in order to update the stuff that's there. That doesn't work for every project, but we found it works pretty well in most of the time that we've done. Yes?
Did you use something like inline entity form in order to make the content creation process simpler?
The question was, do we use inline editing form to make the content creation process simpler? On the Rackspace example, we specifically did use, I can't remember the name of the module. It's the one that the Commerce guys built, so that when you're it basically allows you to edit individual line items in a cart full of stuff. We ended up using that module so that when they made a page that was full of page fragments, they didn't have to go to a bunch of different node creation forms in order to do that. They could create a page and then create those individual fragments or pull in existing fragments from one screen. And that's an example of like the kind of work that we do in order to smooth that editing process. But in that context, it's almost like what is the best way to edit this stuff becomes another kind of display question. It's just for the editors rather than the visitors. Any other questions? Yes?
I kind of want to challenge an assumption or two here.
Yes.
I mean, it seems to me like you sort of set up a dichotomy between the way content appears and is presented in various forms, like you might present the same content on an iPad versus on a web page.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the assumption seems to be that there's this underlying structure that defines the content, and then there's just presentation that is basically cosmetic rearrangement of that. What I tend to find in sort of first the discovery process with the client and then actual site building is that the appearances are very important in figuring out what that structure is, and that it's the mock-ups that show that are the first attempt to show the client what this is going to look like. That is the process by which you figure out the structure. And I don't think that I tend to sort of think the way you're saying this should work, but in practice it seems like both the client who's trying to deliver a message and the website visitors who are trying to find things tend to interact in a very visual-centric way, and I'm starting to think that that's not just cosmetic, but there's more of the substance is embedded in those appearances.
I actually agree. The question was, for most clients who aren't necessarily thinking about content type spreadsheets and pleasant little omnigraphical diagrams with boxes and lines, they want to actually see, okay, but I'm making I want a website. What's it going to be? Where's the stuff? The visual and presentational aspects of it aren't something that can be completely separated from the underlying content. Is that
yeah, I'm not
accurate?
It just seems like the form often dictates the structure more than I think.
Yeah, I mean, in the actual process that we go through on most sites, there isn't some sort of hard and fast wall between those. The design, the wireframes and the early design mock-ups and stuff like that, they inform the process of designing the content model as much as the content model informs what raw building blocks the designer is going to have to work with. It's more of a cyclical process. I think the idea of decoupling the presentational design stuff from the meaning of the underlying assets is less about treating the design as an afterthought or a detail to be taken care of later than making sure that the underlying content model is capable of being used in more than one particular design. I definitely think, we find that when we're looking at an existing website, someone wants to move to Drupal, the design is incredibly important because, looking at the existing design is incredibly important because a lot of the information about what the meaning of the content is communicated via design. It's not simply aesthetic choices. It's things like what are headings, where are things positioned, what appears alongside of other stuff. Design is a way of communicating information not just decorating stuff.
Yeah, I guess my point.
Yeah, no, I mean, so those aspects of it always have to be happening, in conjunction. And you can't simply divorce them entirely. When we actually go to communicate what the content model for a new site is to our clients, that often happens with wireframes in addition to those boxes. Just one way of presenting that stuff, I don't think it is necessarily very effective. But from the perspective of, say, a Drupal site builder who's saying, okay, what actual content types and fields and relationships do I want to set up? Making sure that those decisions aren't overly coupled to a particular visual design is important, because that can make it very difficult when the design inevitably shifts and changes in the future. They both have to work together and inform each other. So I would definitely agree. It's not a simple, you chop them and you separate them.